We got one more guest, one more segment here for this Thursday edition of the show. That is with John Ryan, Bang the Book contributor for us at John Ryan Sports and the #1 on Twitter. John, how's it going today, man?
It's going great, Adam. How about you?
Doing very well, buddy. Appreciate your time here. Thank you so much for joining me once again. And I guess real quickly here, since I've been doing this with a lot of guests throughout the week, the Super Bowl. I know you mentioned you liked San Francisco, thought there was a chance of San Francisco maybe winning that game by some margin. And, for a little bit there, they were. They did have that 10-point lead. Then Kyle Shanahan gets kind of weird with his play calling. Kansas City makes some plays, gets back in it. We all know how the Super Bowl finished up. But, overall, just kind of your impressions on the game and, especially the fact that, you're kind of in that Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, what you kind of saw from those, retail sports books as this business continues to grow.
Well, the game was disappointing down the end, but not shocking. There was some adjustments going on in that game where, Kansas City's linebackers were a big weakness for them. And in the beginning of the game, you could see the 49ers were targeting those types of plays. And then Kansas City made the adjustment. San Francisco didn't. But I was very happy that Andy Reid got his Super Bowl win. He's deserving of it, certainly. I'll preface that, though, that I think Mahomes was the guy who won the game because, in my opinion, Reid was outcoached in the Super Bowl for 3 quarters. And it was going the way we had thought and the way you and I had discussed based on my opinion. But when Mahomes started taking it on his own shoulder, he looked like a kid playing pickup football in the backyard. And he was slinging it all over the place. And the 3rd and 15 play, I think we'll remember for a long time. That was just remarkable. But at the end of the day, I wanted the 49ers. And it just didn't come through. It was the fourth loss now in the Super Bowl in the last 20. So when I look at it that way, the sting isn't so bad.
Well, like we said, we've talked about this a lot here throughout the week that, obviously Nevada did very well. A lot of the other states didn't do so well, although they kind of seem to use the Super Bowl as more of a promotional tool than anything else. So we will see how that plays out going forward. And in particular, when we get some Super Bowl teams that are in jurisdictions where betting is legal. I mean, who knows what the Super Bowl line would have looked like a couple of years ago with the Eagles in it. Obviously there's a chance that the Steelers get back at some point. Maybe the Bears, when Mitch Trubisky is no longer the quarterback, maybe they get there once Illinois goes live. So that'll be something very, very interesting to follow, to say the least, here in future Super Bowls. But let's transition over to the hardwood side of things here, John. And we take a look at the Big East, and you do a week overview over at bangthebook.com for us in both the Big East as well as the Big Ten. Last night, Butler gets their revenge, falls pretty close to the number against Villanova, winning by 3. Providence with a big win over Creighton at home. And, of course, we got several games coming up here on Saturday that we'll take a look at. But, as far as the Big East goes, I mean, are things kind of playing out the way you expected them to?
Yeah, it's the conference ranks 3rd best in the nation on my rankings. Big Ten obviously is light years better than everybody else, and then the Big 12, Big East, and the Big East is so much fun to watch because every game, even if they're playing the worst team in the conference, it's very competitive. There's not one game that a team can count on to win because you always have to be focused and on full alert. Otherwise, you're going to get upset and you're going to go home with a loss. Butler is a great team that could win the conference, certainly. I still like Villanova. Villanova played well last night. They didn't win the game. But I guess in many ways you can be satisfied playing well and coming away with a road loss. But Villanova has a tradition of getting better and better in the month of February, and I think we're seeing that unfold once again. Wright is one of the best coaches in the country, and this isn't anything new. He's basically repeating the process. So I would have to think Villanova is the favorite to win the conference and to get the auto bid to the dance. But there will be many teams from the conference that will go to the tournament for sure.
Well, and I think you look at Villanova last night, and what kind of stands out to me is that Butler had been having some issues offensively, but they wind up with almost 1.3 points per possession against Villanova last night. But Villanova's offense also performed very well against a good Butler defense. And this is something we talked about in the previous segment with Brad Powers, is that you really have to evaluate each and every loss for these teams, because you want to see, was it an outlier? Was it a bad spot? Did they play well but just come up on the short end of the stick? And one thing I have noticed for Villanova here is that they've had some substantial issues forcing turnovers on defense. And with their offense, the more possessions they get, the better off they're going to be. Last night in that game against Butler, they only forced 6 turnovers in that game. Now, of course, Butler only forced 3 of their own, but that's the thing here is, as you really dig into a lot of these games, you want to look at the reasons why a team lost. I think for Villanova last night, there really aren't a lot of reasons that stand out as to why they lost. So that is one that does classify as, one of those quote unquote good losses.
Yeah, I agree, Adam. And the key to beating Villanova is minimizing the second chance scoring opportunities, as you mentioned. And that comes on the rebounding edge. And I believe Butler did a very good job on the defensive end, limiting their second chance scoring opportunities. And that's the first step to beating Villanova. Villanova likes the three. They like to score points. They're really good when they score 81 or more points. And they just fell short last night. I think you're right. It's not a loss where you go, is this an example of the 76ers in the NBA where there is problems? But Villanova is the 10th best team in the country and deservingly so.
Now, I guess I would follow up sort of asking you about this here. We kind of look at Creighton's performance. I know you talked about Creighton in your article over at bangthebook.com here for this week. And Creighton's one of those tough teams because we know that they live and die with a lot of jump shots. When they go on the road, it can be a little bit difficult for them. And they did wind up going on the road here. And they did end up losing last night in pretty lopsided fashion to Providence. A game where they played a good first half, played a bad second half, got badly outscored in the second half. But that's something that we don't talk about as much in the Big East as we do in, say, the Big 10 or the Big 12. But this is a little bit of a tough travel conference sometimes. And there are some teams, Creighton in particular, that may have some issues traveling the rest of the way.
Yeah, and that is what makes the conference so tough. Just like the Big 10, the Big 12, when you go on the road, if you're supposed to win the game being favored by 5 or 6 or 7 points, it's not an automatic win. And if anything, the home team that probably needs to win more than the road warrior in the standings is going to play one of their best games of the season, perhaps, and get the upset win. We've seen a lot of that this year for sure. So in this, this particular game was a bit of a shocker, and it is the opposite of what we talked about with Villanova. This is not a good loss in any stretch of the imagination. And getting outscored 41-20 in the second half against Providence, no matter where it is not a good half of basketball. Their starters, they had 4 players with double-digit points, which isn't bad. But Zagorowski, did not play a good game. He was 1 for 10, and that hurts. 1 for 10 in 39 minutes. So that, 0 for 5 from three-point territory. He did have 7 assists, but that's hard to make up by the other 4 guys on the court when you go 1 for 10.
So that being said, as we take a look at Creighton here, we transition to looking ahead at some of the games coming up on Saturday. They host St. John's. Is this a bounce back spot for the Blue Jays in your mind?
It has to be. In their eyes, they got to go back to the practice and just put it behind them. And, that was one game. We played like crap, and now we're going to face a team that we should beat. But again, it's a situation where St. John's is 2-8 in the conference and second to last place. Only DePaul is worse. So you have to have your guard up. Perhaps this loss yesterday at Providence woke them up and a slap in the face, and they'll come out and play a really solid game against St. John's. So I think that's a game to look at as a bet for sure.
Yeah, and over in your article over at bangthebook.com, you do mention here for St. John's that 2-6 against the spread here on the season with 5 days rest. So they get some time to sit there and think about that game. But of course, Creighton also gets some time to sit there and think about what happened with their blowout loss to Providence. Maybe that is a very, very good spot with everything coming together for us with that Creighton and St. John's game coming up here on Saturday. Seton Hall last night, they're a winner over Georgetown 78-71. They get that aforementioned Villanova team here coming up on Saturday. And I know that's a game that you mentioned in your article that you'd have an update for us on Twitter, but I guess I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here a little bit and say, do you have an update now based on what we saw last night?
Yeah, I do, Adam. I'm going to go with Villanova in that game. I like games in February where you have the two best teams in the conference going head-to-head. I always used to look forward to the ACC, which was normally North Carolina and Duke, but this year that's going to be different. But this is the showdown. This is the game that, without question, will win the conference. Of course, the winner could then end up losing and stumbling, of course, in this conference. But I do think that the winner of this game is going to have enough momentum to hold off everybody else chasing them. Seton Hall did lose to Xavier. That was one of the picks from the article the previous week. And, Villanova has 3 losses. They're 2 games behind. So who needs the game more? And teams that have, like a Seton Hall is certainly outperforming expectations from the preseason. So when they have that first loss, I know personally, a long time ago when I was in sports, there's a tendency to question, like, are we really that good? We just lost to Xavier, which is not a bad team. But we were just rolling along, and all of a sudden, we my goodness, we lost. Maybe we're not as good as they say. And that's where great coaching comes into play. Like a Jay Wright and so many others. So I'm sure Seton Hall will be okay. They're obviously going to the tournament. But this is a game in Philly, and I just don't see how Seton Hall is going to have enough to overcome that home court advantage and everything that Villanova brings to a game that they must win.
Well, you did like Seton Hall last night over Georgetown. They do cover the number. They were -4.5. They won by 7. Now you're going to go against Seton Hall here this weekend against Villanova. And, obviously it makes sense too. I mean, Villanova off of a couple of losses. We'll see what that number ends up looking like. I'm guessing probably Villanova -3.5, -4, something like that, in that type of range. But, you've had a pretty good pulse here on the Big East, and it almost to a degree, and you don't want to, fall victim to this all the time, but that age-old zigzag theory of kind of, bet on one team when they cover and win for you, you kind of go against them the next game, seems like in a balanced conference that may not be the worst of, not approaches, but starting points to kind of take a look at.
Yeah, it is, Adam. This situation that where I'm going to be on Villanova is just coincidental to that. But if you go into any database, and I could do that and post that on Twitter later and give the record for the Big East this year versus other seasons where you're basically betting against a team that is off a 1-game exact ATS loss and going up against a team that's off an exact ATS win, 1 game, no streak. I think the results would be quite good. Around the 60% level, which is quite good.
Now, I will say this. We'll transition over to the NBA here in a second, but getting away from the Big East for just a moment here, Western Carolina and Sanford last night down in the SoCon. Western Carolina wins by 8, covers all the numbers that were out there. That one closed 4, pretty much market wide. But over on your Twitter page, at John Ryan Sports and the number 1, you had a tweet about a system with Sanford, not Stanford, but Sanford, where it was a situation where they just didn't perform very well. And in fact, they wind up not performing very well last night either. So you mentioned a lot of those machine learning tools and a lot of systems that you look at. Sanford was one that came through last night, and I'm sure you'll have plenty more over at John Ryan Sports in the number 1.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to put up at least half a dozen a day. Some days you get busy and you can't do that. But, for everybody that's listening and following, just send me a direct message. And if you have any ideas, like you want to see the results of a team that's off 2 straight losses and is playing a team with a win percentage of 75%. You're only limited by your mind and your creativity to learn about these things. It's just like, wow, I wonder what Villanova does after 2 straight up losses, and that's how you begin the research.
Well, in that Sanford trend last night, they were 0-10-1 against the spread, failing to cover by an average of 8.8 points per game against an opponent shooting 45% or better on the season. And, Western Carolina scores 78 points. And as I mentioned, does cover that number there against Sanford. So make sure you follow John on Twitter at John Ryan Sports, the number 1, to get some of those good trends and systems on a daily basis. But, John, we transition over to the NBA side of things here, and I'll pose a similar question that I asked to Brian Leonard on yesterday's show. The All-Star break is about a week away. We've got 2 games next Thursday night. So 26 teams start the All-Star break either on Tuesday or Wednesday. And we talk about buying low and selling high, and we'll do that here throughout this segment. But are there any types of teams or any types of situations that you do try to buy or sell with that extended All-Star break on the horizon?
I think the teams that, over the years, generally speaking, that are struggling, meaning 40 to 50% win percentage, that are on a 3-game or more losing streak already, are not bounce back candidates. And if anything, they're playing like they just can't wait to get to the break. So that's the one thing I have in mind, looking forward here over the last few days before the break. I did want to mention something about the trades on the bullish side. I think the trades I guess the Sixers trade is still pending, but it looks like it's going to go through. I think that was a home run for that team. Their biggest problem in Philly is that their players are so young that they lack that veteran leadership that all championship teams have. So last year, I would say the veteran leader was probably Jimmy Butler. And now that he's not there, I think there's a really big gap in that leadership role. I don't think it's like the media likes to say it's Embiid versus Simmons and they don't get along, and the pair isn't as good as we thought they were going to be. And I highly disagree with that. I think having a player like Burks in the lineup now, who is having he is having the best year of his career, is going to help them immensely. Especially here in the Philly area, they constantly complain that Simmons won't shoot a 3, that he just simply refuses to shoot it. Well, having Burks now along his side, because he'll play the second guard, is going to be monumental for Simmons, because now he has a trusted shooter to pass to. And in case people haven't noticed, I think Simmons is a definite candidate for Defensive Player of the Year. So he's playing to his strengths. His strengths are not shooting threes, and just because you're in the guard position doesn't mean you have to shoot threes. So I think that's going to go a long way to calming, the Philadelphia Sixer fan base down a little bit here.
Yeah, and I think the trades are really interesting to try and figure out, because on one hand, I look at the NBA as such a rhythmic type of sport, and I think we've talked about that before on our previous segments, where as teams start to win 2 or 3 in a row, maybe it's time to ride that streak. As they start to lose a couple of games in a row, maybe it's time to ride that streak too, because there's just some sort of disconnect. There's something that's short-circuiting with the way that they're doing things, whether it's rotating on offense, rotating on defense, maybe a key substitution player went out, the rotation's all screwed up. A lot of times, the NBA is almost such a detail-oriented league, a very nuanced type of league, because you only have 5 guys out there at once, and they play together for very long stretches of time. So you do sort of look for some of those buy and sell situations with regards to trades as well, and I think maybe you have hit on one here with Philadelphia.
Yeah, I'm bullish on Philly. I think it's reasonable. They're going to be underpriced in the market because of their losing ways and the rhetoric coming out of the media. So I think you go contrary to that, and
Let me interrupt you for a second here, John, because I do want to ask you about that. I know you've got all the machine learning tools, but you mentioned rhetoric. Narrative is something else that we say a lot. Do you find a lot of buy sell just from, kind of taking the pulse of the media and what they're saying about teams?
It's part of the equation. Sentiment is basically what sets the price in the market for the line. So my stuff might say, the outcome of the game, the Sixers should win by 11 against any team. I'm just throwing out an example. But because of the sentiment and how soured people are about the Sixers, they don't want to bet the Sixers and lose money and appear to be stupid, which is human nature. So what happens is the betting line does become steadily more and more undervalued when the sentiment is just overwhelmingly negative. And it works in opposite direction too. If it's overwhelmingly positive, which would be possibly the Miami Heat are getting into that zone of being a little bit overvalued. But again, to circle back to the sentiment, it's something I learned on Wall Street with trading. And when you have 70% of the people being bullish versus 30% bearish, for whatever reason, the side to be on is the bear side. So in the case of the Sixers, everybody's bearish on the Sixers. Would never bet them, and if it was the last game on the card, and that's where you probably want to start looking. And it's hard to do. It took me a long time to do the opposite of your intuition, but believe me, it definitely works.
Well, the Miami Heat here, possibly a fade candidate going into the All-Star break. 5 games in 8 days out on the road out west. So a long road trip for them. Maybe some of their prices do wind up, being in a pretty good range here. But to circle back, and obviously there will be a good number of trades here, I would say, by this 3 o'clock deadline here today. But to circle back to talking about the All-Star break, you mentioned not looking for a great bounce back factor from teams that are already not playing well, already looking forward to the All-Star break. Is there a flip side to that coin? Are there teams that you would look to buy?
Yeah, the teams that are playing them. Not to be, stating the obvious here, but, if I have the Miami Heat, which I just said are overvalued, but not quite yet, but coming down to the finish line here for the first half of the, before the All-Star break, the Heat would be a candidate to play against one of those teams that's on a 3-game losing streak. And again, these are professional athletes, and they don't necessarily think, like I'm going to suggest they do, but a team that has a losing record, realizing that they're not going to be in the playoffs, there was no attempt to improve the team through trade, is facing a team that is definitely in the playoff mix or one of the division leaders. You can't be too optimistic that you're going to beat them. And then the better team, the one that's in contention, is going to be pumped up to make sure they do win and they get that positive momentum going into the All-Star break so that when they come out of it, it's still all positive. I hope that made sense.
No, it does. No, I totally agree and understand with what you're saying there. And I guess that sort of leads me to my next question of, maybe outside of these streaky teams here, is there a team you're looking to buy low right now in the NBA?
There's a couple that are really appealing right now. Let me just take a look at my grid here because there's many of them that are candidates. The Denver Nuggets with their move and their star player, they definitely are on the buy list. Between now and the All-Star break, and then certainly the rest of the season, I'm sure there'll be numerous plays from my models to play on the Nuggets. Their trade obviously is going to help them immensely. So that's one that we definitely want to look at. There's one stat I look at too in the second half of the season, and it's double-digit scorers. And as simple as it sounds, it really is a valuable metric. So we're talking about the Heat, and sometimes you hear in the media like, how can the Heat be having this great a season? Well, you do a quick search in the database, and they lead the league with having 42 games with 5 or more double-digit scores. So the fact that just tells you right there that they're passing the ball well, they're sharing it. It truly doesn't matter who scores the points, and it's all gelling. The chemistry is quite good on the Heat, and that's reflecting why it is. Conversely, the teams on the bottom of that metric, the Hawks have had 10 games of 5 double-digit scores. They have the superstar down there that is scoring a lot of the points for the team. The Warriors have 17. Interestingly, the 76ers only have 23 games where they had 5 double-digit scores. So that, again, getting back to the Sixers story, that, again, tells you how important this Burks acquisition is. And, Glenn Robinson is hitting 40% from three-point territory in his own right. And this might be the opportunity that Robinson needs to have to resurrect his career. So now the Sixers have that perimeter. They have 2 good perimeter three-point shooters coming on this roster. So that 23 number is going to go up in the second half. And that's another reason to be bullish on them. The Lakers are in the same camp as the Sixers. They have 26 games with 5 or more double-digit scores. They're led by, obviously, LeBron and AD. But they know themselves from their veteran experience that they're going to have other players start stepping up if they're going to win the championship. So there again, the Lakers, despite having such a great record, you can still be bullish on them. Just looking at some of the other ones here, Adam. Toronto. Toronto is definitely a bull candidate, and I would expect them to possibly make a run again for the division title, and also they could be a contender for the conference. They have had 33 games, 5 or more double-digit scores. They have a great assist-to-turnover ratio. They rebound well. There's nothing glaringly bad that I can say about Toronto that would make me cautious in any game that pops up from my models.
Well, of course, depth such a big thing, especially because, if you're dependent on 2 or 3 players, if one of those guys has an off night, makes it very, very difficult for you. And we see that all the time in college basketball, where some of these teams just have 1 or 2 primary scorers. And if one of those 2 guys are off or is off, and, if both of them are off, then they don't really have a chance. So, sharing is caring, I guess they would say here in the NBA. A very good system there from John Ryan. Make sure you follow him on Twitter at John Ryan Sports and the number 1. And John, I know you wanted to share a special offer with our listeners today.
Yeah, I thought it would be a good idea to have people get 5 days of free premium service, the plays that my models produce, the same plays that are hitting 60% and 62% in the NBA and college basketball this season. Over the last 3 seasons, spanning 551 college and NBA picks, I am a documented 61% against the spread on several websites. So having 5 free days gives you a real good test drive of how my methodology works, that it's not based on games of the year, games of the month. It's simply every day you wake up, you grind it out, win or lose, you wake up the next day, grind it out. But having the confidence knowing that over the time period of a season that it's going to be profitable. And that's been the number 1 key to my success is you don't get too high, you don't get too low. If you go 0-4, you wake up and you go at it again. You go 4-0, you don't get all full of yourself and think that you've just solved the mysteries of the world. Every day is a challenge and an opportunity. So the key to get to 5 days, send me a direct message on Twitter and use the password Adam. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me. And again, make sure you follow John on Twitter at John Ryan Sports and the number 1 and use that password Adam for 5 days for free of John's premium service. John, always a pleasure, man. Thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate our time together, and we'll talk to you again next week.
You got it. Thank you very much, Adam.
There you go. There's John Ryan once again on Twitter at John Ryan Sports and the number 1. 5 days free of premium service. Send him a DM with that password Adam. Coming up on our Friday edition of Bang the Book Radio, I'll do a grab bag segment, talk some NBA, NHL, MLB, and college basketball heading into the weekend. And we'll also chat with our friend Greg Peterson from the Hoopin' with Hoops podcast. You can also hear him on VSiN. We'll chat with Greg about all things college basketball here heading on into the weekend. That'll do it for me. Thank you so much for listening, everybody, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.